والله يدعو إلى دار السلام ويهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم.
The second thing that the author mentions, the second thing which softens a person's heart, he said, وَمِنْهَا الْإِحْسَانُ إِلَى الْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ. وَمِنْهَا الْإِحْسَانُ إِلَى الْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ. That from those matters which soften a believer's heart is showing ihsan, showing goodness to the orphans and the poor people. Showing goodness to the orphans and the poor people. This is also something which will soften a person's heart if it has become hardened. And he mentioned al-ihsan. He said al-ihsan ila al-yatama wal-masakin. The meaning of ihsan in the Arabic language, they say it is ضد al-isa'a. It is the opposite of harming. So al-isa'a means to harm somebody. The opposite of isa'a is al-ihsan. I show goodness to somebody. And the word ihsan, it comes in the Quran, it comes in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, it comes with two different meanings. One of the usages of al-ihsan is regarding the worship of Allah. Al-ihsan fi ibadat al-khaliq. Doing ihsan in the worship of Allah. And the other meaning of ihsan is al-ihsan fi huquq al-khalq. Is ihsan with regards to the rights of the rest of the creation. These are the two usages of the word ihsan in the Quran and the Sunnah. Ihsan with regards to the worship of Allah, it means أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه وإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. Like we studied in the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam in Al-Usul al-Thalatha, when we studied the three fundamental principles, when Jibreel alayhi salam came in the shape of a man, in the form of a man, when some of the companions were sitting with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the hadith is narrated by Umar radiallahu anhu in Sahih Muslim. He said, بيننا جلوس عند النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. One day we were sitting with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. إذ طلع علينا رجل. When all of a sudden a man appeared and he started coming towards the Prophet. He said, شديد سواد الشعر. That his hair was very black and tidy. And his clothes were very white and clean and pristine. And he came and he sat next to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. And then this man, he asked the Prophet certain questions. He said, Ya Muhammad, O Muhammad, أخبرني عن الإحسان. أخبرني عن الإسلام. Tell me about Islam. What is Islam? And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned the 5 pillars of Islam. Then he said, Ya Muhammad, أخبرني عن الإيمان. O Muhammad ﷺ, inform me about Iman. What is Iman? And the Prophet ﷺ, he told him about the 6 pillars of Al-Iman. Then he said, فَأَخْبِرْنِي عَنِ الْإِحْسَانِ. Tell me about Ihsan. What is the meaning of Al-Ihsan? And the Prophet ﷺ said, the meaning of Ihsan is أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. That you should worship Allah as if you can see Him. As if you can see Him and He is in front of you. This is how you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, in your worship, you should be exalting Him so much that it's as if you're standing in front of Him. And it's as if you can see Him. But if you cannot reach this level, and this is the level of the worship of the awliya and the salihin and the anbiya and the mursaleen, may Allah make us from them and our children from them. If you cannot worship Allah at this level, then the least level is that you know that Allah sees you. And because Allah sees you all the time, and He has obligated this worship upon you, that you have to fulfill the worship. And we mentioned that the highest level of worship is the first level, that you stand in front of Allah in your prayer as if Allah is in front of you. This is how much sakina, this is how much tama'nina, this is how much khushu that you have. And the level which is lower is that you worship Allah out of your fear of Him, because He knows that you know because that He sees you. So the first level of ihsan is you worshipping Allah out of your love for Him. Not because you're fearful of the obligation and the punishment, but because you want the reward. This is what causes you and pushes you to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the level which is lower than this is that you worship Allah because it's an obligation upon you, and because you're fearful of the repercussions or the punishment of not worshipping Allah, not fulfilling this obligation. I'll give an example. Let's say, for example, young brothers and sisters living in a house, and you live with your parents, and you want to, or you show obedience to your parents. If somebody comes to you and says to you, why do you show obedience to your parents? One of the children will say, I show obedience to my parents because I love Allah, and I want to do it for the sake of Allah. And the reason why I'm showing obedience to my parents is because I want to gain the reward and the happiness and the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through showing obedience to my father and my mother, or my mother and my father. The second son, he says, the reason why I show obedience to my parents is because I'm scared of the punishment of Allah. Allah ordered me to do it, and if I don't do it, then maybe there'll be punishment in the hereafter. So because of that, that's why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it just to fulfill the obligation. From both of these, the one who is greater in his reward is the first one. Because he's not doing it because it's a mere obligation, or because he's just scared of the punishment, but he's doing it from himself. He does it, and he does even more. Why? Because he's doing it to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the other one is doing it because it's an obligation, and I need to fulfill the obligation. Even the second person, he's still fulfilling the obligation. He's still being obedient to his parents, and Allah is pleased with that person. But the intention or the drive for both of these people, it differs. This is the meaning of ihsan when it comes to ibadatul khaliq, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you worship Allah as though you can see Him, and if you cannot do this, then you know that He sees you, and therefore you worship Allah because it is an obligation. However, the other meaning of ihsan is fulfilling the rights of the creation. And that is, it is badlul ma'ruf. It is for a person to strive his best to show goodness to the rest of the creation. This is the meaning of ihsan, doing good when it comes to the rest of the creation. That you try your best to do good and be in the service of the rest of the creation. And remember, when I say the rest of the creation, I didn't say just the Muslims. In fact, I didn't even say just the humans. In all of creation, Muslims, non-Muslims, human beings, animals, the environment, the trees, moving an obstacle from the road, all of this is ihsan. All of this comes under al-ihsan. But the factor here is that this ihsan towards the rest of the creation, it has to be more than the obligation. So a person can't say, for example, that the fact that I spend on my children, this is ihsan. This isn't ihsan, because this is an obligation. A person thinks that I'm going to show obedience to my parents, and this is ihsan. This isn't ihsan, because this is a wajib. So ihsan is striving your best to do good towards other people above the obligation. Giving a zakat, for example, of course it's an act of good, but it doesn't come under the meaning of al-ihsan, because that is an obligation anyway. Those poor people, they have a right on your wealth, and it isn't ihsan from you that you are giving that wealth. Why? Because that wealth is their right in the first place. But ihsan is when you've given your zakat, you fulfilled the obligation. Now on top of this, you're going to go and give charity to people and feed poor people and so on and so forth. So al-ihsan, when it comes to fulfilling the rights of the creation, it is badlul ma'ruf. It is striving to show goodness, ma yuzidu ala al-wujub, what is above the level of the obligation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He praises in the Quran those people who have ihsan. Those people who do goodness and show goodness to Allah in His worship and to the rest of creation. And He orders us to have ihsan, to show goodness to the people and the creation. Allah said in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَأَحْسِنُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Make ihsan, do ihsan, show goodness, Because Allah loves the people of al-ihsan. He loves the muhsinin.